Well, last week in our Shepherd's Bookshelf, we began the subject of dispensationalism, and as I said there, I think it's about time that we talked about this and looked into the actual uh, detailed scholarly works that talk about dispensationalism. The main tenets of dispensationalism: the idea that the church is not Israel, the idea of the hermeneutic that controls the dispensational thought, which I'll get to in just a few moments. The idea is that there is a rapture prior to the tribulation period, and then after the tribulation, the coming of Jesus Christ and judgment upon the earth and setting up of his earthly kingdom for 1,000 years. All those are basic tenets of dispensationalism that a lot of people know something about. But the details, the more academic, more biblical issues related to dispensationalism is pretty much ignored today by those outside of the realm of dispensationalism. And as I mentioned last week, it is hard to publish a book defending dispensationalism or even talking about dispensational principles or theology in the major publishing houses because I guess because they don't think it sells, or they believe it's not important and they dismissed it and have moved on and believe that Reformed theology, covenantal theology in particular, is where it's all at. Well, so Hummel said in his work that we looked at last week, and again I'll show this book to you, The Rise and the Fall of Dispensationalism, more of a historical treatise on that subject. Hummel basically is dismissive of all academic scholarly works today, doesn't actually believe they exist, that no true scholar today is, or at least very few, are dispensationalists. So I want to challenge that today and draw your attention to at least a couple of books that would at least get us in the ballpark, recently written books that will get us in the ballpark of the fact that there are very solid, very academically sound theologians who are dispensationalists and are doing an excellent job of showing why this is is the biblical theology we ought to embrace. And even if you have a different position, I think you owe it to yourself to study the other side of the story. And one of the things I would say on that is that most Reformed covenantal theologians I know, even those that are pretty academically solid and sound, good scholars, and some that I do know, have drawn their understanding of dispensationalists from people who are not dispensationalists. They have read the work of Gerstner and different ones who have basically done a snow job on dispensationalism. They don't understand it. They wrote books about it even though they don't understand it. And a lot of covenantal Reformed people have read their books and believe this is what dispensationalism teaches, and often it is not. Now, some of us on staff here looked at a paper by a Reformed theologian on why he rejects dispensationalism. It's on their website. And when we looked through the list of about 12 things that he questioned or denied about the system, about 8 of them we reject too. That these are not truly what dispensationalists teach. So if you're going to study something, if you're going to attack it or embrace it or challenge it or whatever you're going to do, go to the primary sources. Read the books that are put out by the people that believe what they're teaching, not by people who reject it. That's not good scholarship. So let's take a look at a book or two that would be in our realm that are recently booked. There are many books that I could recommend going back from at least to the 50s and even before that if we wanted to go back to Darby and different ones. But here's a recent book written called Discovering Dispensationalism. This is put out by Corey Marsh and James Frazzo, who are professors at Southern California Seminary. They are editors of this book. They have brought together about a dozen of dispensational scholars. They're not all on the same page, these dozen guys. Some of them have a little bit different wrinkle, but they're all dispensationalists of some sort. And they have done an excellent job of really understanding and teaching what this is all about. And their methodology is to to go through the various eras of church history and to trace dispensational thought throughout all those eras. One of the criticisms of dispensationalism by those that don't understand it is that this is a modern invention. Nobody ever heard of it before. Nobody ever had these ideas until the 1800s, and Darby came along and began to write books, and the brethren got it out, and it got popular through Schofield and Dallas Seminary and so forth. But that is simply not true, and this book does an excellent job of showing that it is not true. As I said last time, the system itself, what we would call dispensationalism, has been formulated in more modern times. But so has covenant theology. There has been changes in that started basically the Westminster Confession is the first confession to bring up covenantal theology. And so it has changed. It has been upgraded by covenantalists since that time. Same is true of dispensationalism. And there'll still be challenges and upgrades as time goes on. But throughout all of church history, there have been dispensational thoughts and theology and ideas that have been out there. Now, it went underground for a long time because, as these writers will show in another book I'll show in a moment, the allegorical approach to Scripture became very popular in the early days of Christianity. And once that took place, once the literal grammatical hermeneutic, historical hermeneutic that we embrace, once that was pretty much rejected and an allegorical approach to understanding Scripture took hold, that began to change everything. And dispensationalism became a minority thought. Any of those things that were out there, they were pretty much dismissed. And the Roman Catholic Church picked up this allegorical approach, and Christianity at large was allegorical in its approach to Scripture. And that's true today. But with the Reformation, the Reformers came back and said the Bible can be understood by serious students of the Word, and that we can approach the Bible with a literal, normal hermeneutic, and therefore things began to change, and we began to understand Scripture clearly, and that was the great outcome of the Reformation. However, going back to Augustine, there were certain aspects of Scripture that was not read with a grammatical historic hermeneutic, a literal hermeneutic. Instead, there was a spiritualizing or allegorizing hermeneutic that remained in a number of areas. That included some ecclesiology, this doctrine of the church, a doctrine of eschatology, of last things, and some other things as well. And that is where Reformed theology, covenantal theology, and dispensationalism part ways in some areas of our understanding. It really goes back to our hermeneutic. But before I mention any more of that, I just want to mention this book really does a good job of tracing down how dispensational thought has moved throughout the ages, defining and clarifying a number of things. I'm going to read a quote. It's a little bit heavy, but remember we're looking at academic books on dispensationalism now. And James Fazio wrote this definition in the book, page 45. He says, dispensationalism is the theological system which reflects God's administration over his household, whereby a sovereignly appointed steward has administrated a divinely apportioned measure of God's grace. Each of these administrations, which have occurred throughout the successive ages, have ended in judgment and will find their culmination in the coming Messianic kingdom. Now that's a mouthful. I agree with that, but that gets us into the ballpark of what dispensationalism really is and why people ought to look at it more carefully and not be dismissive of it. Now, in this particular journal, that are probably not familiar to too many people, but the Journal of Dispensational Theology, I, by the way, am the book review editor for this particular journal, but there's a book review here, an extensive one by James Quigley called On This Particular Book. So if you just want to read a book review, extensive one, and I have one in here as well, but his is more extensive, this would be a good place to start. And this is a good journal that you might want to get a hold of from the Journal of Dispensational Theology. Along with that, I would mention a podcast network that I'm involved with called Foundations Media that has 7 different ministries that are promoting dispensational thought. Our theme is this: we're biblical, contextual, and consistent. So what distinguishes much of the theology between covenantal theologians and dispensational theologians is when we differ, because we agree on most of the major parts of theology, but where we differ usually comes down to our hermeneutic. Are we consistently applying the same hermeneutic, the same method of interpreting the Bible throughout all Scripture, whereas instead of just part of Scripture? And our critique of covenantal theology is that they apply this grammatical historical hermeneutic through most of the Bible. And that is why we agree on all the major doctrines of Scripture. But when it comes to certain parts, they change their hermeneutic, and so they're not consistent. The dispensationalists, our claim to fame, if we have one, is that we're consistent in our hermeneutic. Now, if you're not sure what that is, here's a nice little book by Michael Vlock called Dispensational Hermeneutics. This is a concise book. It's barely over 100 pages. It's readable. It's accessible to everybody. But I think it can help anybody that wants to understand the storyline of Scripture and how we should interpret it. This will be a real good start in doing that. Michael Vlock was at Master's Seminary for quite some time as one of their teachers. He's now a professor at Shepherd's Seminary in Cary, North Carolina. He's a true dispensational scholar, probably one of the best in the world today, and I recommend his writings. He's written a number of books that are very helpful in this regard. But this is the hermeneutic. He gives us 10 principles of dispensational hermeneutics. And then he gives 5 principles of those who are non-dispensational and how we differ. Very, very helpful, very insightful, well worth the read for anybody who is working through this kind of a subject. So I recommend Michael Vlock's excellent little book. So keep in mind as we close this down for today, what we're looking at then, the differences, I think the major piece of dispensationalism that holds it all together is the hermeneutic. How do we approach the Bible? Do we do it consistently? The dispensationalists, I believe, succeed in this regard of coming to the Bible in all of its parts, in all of its genres, in every aspect from narrative to history to theology to prophecy with the same hermeneutic. And that is that it can be understood by the person who gives careful attention to it. There's no secret code. There's no allegorization that changes the meaning to something different. It is a literal, normal hermeneutic of approaching the Bible. And we believe that is the stronghold of dispensationalism, and why we've taken a couple weeks for you to get a handle on that and to look at some good books that I think you would enjoy and would be helped by. So I hope this is helpful. We'll move on to another subject next week.